Well, when I did Star Wars, I consciously set about to recreate myths and the classic mythological motifs. I wanted to use those motifs to deal with issues that existed today.
He was never afraid to take chances with it. He was never afraid to challenge what the norm was with it.
George has always told me, making Star Wars, any subject can be a Star Wars story. If we took the plot of American Graffiti, we could apply it to Star Wars. They would just be in land speeders instead of cars. To George, the most important thing about the story is the emotions that drive it and the characters that are in it.
And that's what I learned the most, was that when we were the most like Star Wars in Clone Wars, when we were doing things that was the least like anything you'd seen before.
If it's a tool that can be used to make old stories be new and relate to younger people, that's what the whole point was.
When I was a kid, there was only one thing capable of making the whole family run downstairs, sit in front of the TV, and shut up for about 30 minutes. It sounded like this. For 6 seasons and a movie, George Lucas, Dave Filoni, and the studio of Lucasfilm Animation gave my family and I Star Wars: The Clone Wars, an episodic animated series set in the Star Wars universe. It's the reason my mom never went out on Friday nights, the reason I only ever did book reports on Clone Wars books in grade school, and one of the reasons I wanted to become a storyteller. All because of some dumb kid show on Cartoon Network. But anyone who's seen The Clone Wars in its entirety knows that's not true. Clone Wars goes farther and deeper than most animated shows, unafraid to tackle difficult subjects through a fictional lens and show its characters in deeply complicated, emotional peril. It also happens to be one of the most tasteful portrayals of Star Wars since, well, the original trilogy. Don't get me wrong, The Clone Wars isn't perfect, and that's plain to see from just the earliest strokes of the show. But The Clone Wars has always been ambitious, which has ultimately led to some of the most genuinely subversive, meaningful animated storytelling to ever be put to television. Make no mistake, The Clone Wars is one of the greatest animated shows of all time. However, while I was a fan of the show as a kid, I never understood what made The Clone Wars so special. I knew what my favorite episodes were and who my favorite characters were, but I wasn't yet capable of grasping the artistry and craftsmanship behind the show. In rewatching the entire series over the last few months in preparation for the 7th and final season, I think I do now. There's a lot of things that set Clone Wars apart from other animated works, many of which we already mentioned, but many other things that may surprise you. The making of this show isn't a story of master craftsmen siphoning light from the heavens and converting it into perfect television. This is ultimately the story of how a family of humble artists and creatives embarked on a journey with one of the greatest mythological storytellers of our time, and through his guidance and wisdom, as well as the lessons of their own mistakes, created something far bigger than themselves. Something that may one day be as timeless as the original trilogy itself. This is hopefully also the story of how The Clone Wars inspired the next generation of storytellers who watched it, like myself, to become who they were meant to be. Nevertheless, this is the legend of Star Wars: The Clone Wars. In 2002, Lucasfilm commissioned Genndy Tartakovsky, the creator of Dexter's Laboratory and Samurai Jack, to produce a 2D animated series to depict the major events of the Clone Wars after Attack of the Clones, setting the stage for the third film in the Star Wars prequels, Revenge of the Sith. The show was released in 25 short chapters, released over the span of the next 2 years. The series infamously showed the knighting of Anakin Skywalker, the introduction of Asajj Ventress and General Grievous, and the abduction of Chancellor Palpatine. Though I didn't discover it until years after it premiered, I still fell in love with the show and the thrilling sense of scale and insanity it added to Star Wars. The stylish animation and expressive reimaginings of classic Star Wars designs are a testament to Tartakovsky's genius, and today, the show is probably considered one of the best pieces of Star Wars media ever produced. However, there is one big issue I have with the show, or rather, an issue I have with the greater story it fits into. Clone Wars adds virtually nothing to the mythology of Star Wars. Sure, you get to see the key events that fill in aspects of the prequels, such as the knighting of Anakin and how he got that scar, how Grievous earned his reputation, and just what kind of forces the Jedi were up against. But almost none of these things significantly flesh out the characters involved, the logic of the greater story being told, or the themes of the series. And that's perfectly fine. Because that's not what Clone Wars was for, and it never could have been. Tartakovsky told Clone Wars in a way only he could, and as an artist, that is probably the most important and most respectable thing about the show's creation. But at the end of the day, Clone Wars was nothing more than an easily overlooked footnote in the Star Wars saga. This leads us to Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. In the past few years, as the internet has given the prequel generation a voice, the discourse surrounding the prequels has effectively shifted from overwhelming hatred to apologetic admiration, particularly in regards to Revenge of the Sith. Though I agree that Revenge of the Sith is the best prequel film and potentially one of the most powerful films in the saga, it still suffers from writing issues and flawed direction that affects the whole trilogy. It's not that the story Lucas was telling was bad, it's the way he was presenting it that lessened its impact. The film was missing an enormous amount of context for conflicts and character motivations that the previous films didn't really make up for. Does Anakin's distrust for the Council really only come from not being promoted to Master? Or is this just the latest contradiction in a long line of bullshit from the Council that we haven't seen? Is Anakin's insistence on saving a Sith Lord, who he's sworn to destroy, based entirely on a half-promise to save Padme from death? Or is there more to the relationship between these two men? Are all clones trained to just turn on the Jedi when instructed, in spite of the 3+ years of camaraderie built up between them? Or is there something else at play in their commands? Did the entire Jedi Order really fail to sense a super powerful Sith Lord frequently tipping the balance of the Force right under their noses? Or have they just been on a wild goose chase for the last few years? And did Anakin really meet General Grievous for the first time in Revenge of the Sith? That one's a yes. Lucas provided answers to these questions in the best way he possibly could within the confines of the story, but you have to believe that those 3+ years of the Clone Wars before the films were pretty instrumental in setting up the bombs that go off in Episode 3. And this show wasn't completely demonstrating that. And I suspect that, well, Lucas knew this. George Lucas knew that the story of Anakin Skywalker's rise and fall was too big for 3 films. So, from a certain point of view, as Ben Kenobi puts it, if you've only watched the prequels, you don't know the full story. You've received the most important beats of it, but not its entirety. And that's why, in 2005, Lucas announced a 3D continuation of Tartakovsky's series, called Star Wars: The Clone Wars. The show would build off the canon of Tartakovsky's series and follow many of the lead characters of the prequel films, particularly Anakin and Obi-Wan. Due to its depiction of war, Lucas was insistent on aiming the show at a slightly more mature audience than just kids, sort of like a pseudo PG-13 animated show, which had apparently never been done before.
And I can use CG animation, which we developed, and some other new technology and techniques to really make a great TV show.
It's important to understand why exactly Lucas is doing this. Beyond wanting to further address the story of the Clone Wars, Lucas had long wanted to break into television. He grew up watching episodic serials like Flash Gordon, which has always been one of Star Wars' biggest influences. With his own TV show, Lucas could finally bring his career full circle to the medium that inspired him in the first place. Utilizing CG animation may have been an odd and unpopular choice for a TV series, but it allowed Lucas the freedom to tell his stories at an even bigger scope than the prequels, which would be necessary for the scale of the Clone Wars, while also retaining the viscerality of a Star Wars film. And Lucas could have been done with Star Wars after the prequels, which many criticized Lucas for either rushing for the sake of selling toys, turning another 3 movies a profit, or some other monetary gain. Because after all, a man who donates $4 billion to a foundation for education is only in it for the money. At the end of the day, Lucas simply wanted to tell another story. One that was possibly just as important to him, if not more important than the prequels. With the secret formation of Lucasfilm Animation in 2003, Lucas began scouring the industry for a showrunner, a supervising director to oversee the production of the show, and someone who could comply with Lucas's story demands. Lucas was looking for an apprentice, so to speak, one who not only had a background in animation, but could demonstrate a deep knowledge and love for Star Wars. Someone that today's Star Wars fans would come to know as Dave Filoni. Dave Filoni grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to an architect father and singer-musician mother. Filoni's father had such a love for film that he insisted on passing it down to his son, showing him old Kurosawa, Bergman, Star Trek, and Godzilla films from a very young age. He grew up watching Saturday morning cartoons like Dungeons & Dragons, and later on, animated epics like Fantasia and Akira. And of course, he was also a big Star Wars fan. As an adult, Filoni worked around the animation industry, cultivating experience and connections at studios such as Film Roman, MTV Animation, and Walt Disney Pictures. In all this time, Filoni has never considered himself a great animator, but as a profession, it's given him the chance to explore his love of storytelling, a love that would go with him when he came on as a director for Avatar: The Last Airbender in 2004 at Nickelodeon. Meanwhile, in between working on the opening credits for Airbender, Chris Pernosky, a prominent figure in the animation industry and the founder of Titmouse Animation, overheard the conversations Filoni and animator Giancarlo Volpe had about Star Wars, and professed his dislike for the prequels. Filoni, the unabashed Star Wars fan he was, found a way to completely flip Pernosky's opinions around about the films in a way that surprised even him. So when Lucasfilm called Pernosky about finding a supervising director for their upcoming animated Star Wars series, in his head, there was only one man for the job.
And my whole ambition was just to interview. I just wanted to meet George, so when I was in line at Revenge of the Sith, I can say, yeah, well, I met George Lucas. How cool is that? Because I'm like, there's no way I'm going to get this job. Because I felt like immensely underqualified for the job. And he looked at my portfolio and he kind of went through it like this. You know, we looked at things briefly. And then he shut it. And he goes, well, this is what a Jedi Knight is. So I thought it's great. He was really nice. And that was over. And then the door opens and Catherine sticks her head in and says, he likes you, you got the job. And I was like, what? And then she shut the door. And I remember my first thought was like, oh my gosh, these people have no idea what they're doing. Like, I thought, like, you're going to hire me for this job?
Lucas was never interested in hiring someone with a glowing resume, a Tartakovsky, if you will. He wanted someone who could tap into the mythology of Star Wars without being overwhelmed by it. Someone who respected the integrity of the source material, but wasn't afraid to challenge it. Filoni may have been a loyal fan as anyone else, but like Lucas, he was a storyteller, and was guided by a rich background of films, TV, and artwork ever since he was a kid. Perhaps Lucas recognized this, or maybe he was simply in the right place at the right time. Who knows? Regardless, the hiring of Dave Filoni signified a decisive moment in the history of Lucasfilm. The foreseeable future of Star Wars now rested on the back of a guy from Pittsburgh with a cowboy hat. Over the next few years leading up to 2008, the key figures of the Clone Wars team started to fall into place. David Accord and Matthew Wood, both of whom had previous experience working at Lucasfilm, came on as chief sound editors for the show. Kevin Kiner came on as the composer, who had previously made a living composing for a wide variety of TV shows and films. Jason Tucker was hired as the supervising editor after years of assistant editing for TV, while Killian Plunkett graduated from being a comic book writer and artist to eventually coming on the show as a lead designer and concept artist. A team of writers came together: Henry Gilroy, Stephen Melching, Scott Murphy, with several more to come. The team for the show was big, but it was only going to get bigger. As the crew for the show assembled, developing an art style and animation proved to be rather difficult. The cost deficit between feature animation and television animation was pretty steep, and to meet the demand of an action-packed 3D animated show set in the Star Wars universe was only going to make it harder to stay within budget. Lucas was strongly against using photorealistic animation, not just because it would drive up the cost, but because it would demean the artistic direction he wanted to take with the series. As such, the final animation style the crew settled on was sort of a pseudo 3D evolution of Tartakovsky's art style, with some noteworthy changes. The characters were made to emulate painted wood puppets like the marionettes from the 1960 series The Thunderbirds, which Lucas grew up with. The surfaces of characters, objects, and the relative environments would be made up of painted textures, while backgrounds would be made up of matte paintings. At times, the show does look like a moving painting, albeit with 3D cartoon characters in the foreground. But the style is usually effective, and would go on to evolve and improve drastically over the course of the show. Rather than relying on storyboards, as many animation studios do today, Lucas insisted on directing the show like he would a feature film, through cutting and editing. This was an uncommon and somewhat challenging method of directing animation, but the effect it has speaks volumes in the final product. A lot of Clone Wars episodes do feel like miniature movies, in spite of the quirks of the animation style or the merciless length, and that's by no mistake. While Dave Filoni's direction was instrumental in the success of the show, Jason Tucker probably had the most important job of anyone on the team. He had to work around the clock on nearly every episode in whatever state it was in just to create the cinematic feeling Lucas was so keen on having for the show. Over time, the team realized that working on a Clone Wars episode wasn't just about bringing the story to life. It was also about surpassing Lucas's expectations. Because no matter how many scripts Lucas rewrote or cuts he meddled with, Dave Filoni and the team understood that Star Wars fans deserved the best they could give them. But before they could take the show on the air and show Star Wars fans what they had been passionately working away on for the last few years, there was one pretty significant hurdle the team had to deal with first: the Clone Wars movie. As the Clone Wars started to come along and episodes were finalized, Lucas took to viewing some of the completed footage in his theater at Skywalker Ranch. In doing so, an idea came over him. The Clone Wars should be seen on the big screen first. Though they were well underway on making episodes for the show, the Clone Wars team was still heavily focused on refining the look and storytelling of the series. The sudden move to produce a film was very much throwing a wrench into the works. The standard between television animation and film animation is drastically different, and the studio probably wasn't going to meet that standard. So instead of developing an entirely separate storyline for the film, the Clone Wars team converted 4 of their already developed episodes into a feature film. The episodes were originally entitled Castle of Deception, Castle of Doom, and Castle of Salvation, while a standalone episode entitled The New Padawan would be the film's opening. As Warner Bros. Secured the film distribution rights from Lucas, the Clone Wars movie was released on August 15, 2008, for a mere budget of just $8.5 million. By comparison, Up, which was released a year later, had a budget of $175 million. I think we all see the issue here. As a massive fan of the show, let me just say that the Clone Wars movie deserves every ounce of criticism it's ever received. The animation looks unfinished and laughably poor compared to the other animated features released around the same time. The film has very awkward pacing and very clearly feels like 4 episodes stitched together. Every 25 minutes, a character walks on screen to remind you the state of affairs and where the heroes are at currently. Padme has a pretty important role in the film, but she isn't even introduced until 3/4 of the way through. The first act of the film is probably the most developed and best looking chunk of the film, which isn't surprising given that this was originally supposed to be a flashback episode in the series and was thus developed far after the other 3 episodes the movie was based on. The sound editors clearly mixed the audio of the film differently for a theater experience than how they mixed the rest of the show, but unfortunately, everything in the film ends up sounding bass boosted, and it gets kind of annoying. On the other hand, in spite of its issues, I do feel the Clone Wars movie has several redeeming qualities. If you watch this as a kid who's into Star Wars, the movie kicks ass. There's some cool set pieces and plenty of lightsaber fights. Kevin Kinder's score adds new instrumental flair to the expected Williams orchestration, heavily emphasizing drums, brass instruments, and the guitar at times. The voice acting isn't half bad either. Matt Lanter is well cast for the role of Anakin and manages to make the character more likable than the live-action films. James Arnold Taylor is charming as Obi-Wan Kenobi, and after hearing D. Bradley Baker's voice so much, you almost forget that Tamara Morrison ever voiced the clones. Tom Kane lends multiple voices throughout the film, and even provides the film's opening narration, which by itself was a red flag for many viewers going in skeptical. Though I agree it doesn't have the same impact or personality as the opening crawl, the opening narration is inspired by classic radio dramas, like The March of Time, sort of like how the opening crawl of the films is based on Flash Gordon.
In order to establish some measure of national defense, the Filipinos have adopted compulsory military training and an armament program which calls for the expenditure of $8 million a year for the next 6 years.
The Clone Wars movie is also infamous for the introduction of a now beloved character in the current Star Wars canon, Ahsoka Tano. When Dave Filoni first pitched his idea of the Clone Wars to George Lucas, he wanted to focus on a crew of characters aboard a ship like the Millennium Falcon, separate from the main characters of the films. Lucas obviously rejected the pitch, but he did like some of Filoni's other ideas and carried them over to the show. One of those being a teenage Togruta named Ashla. As Lucas and Filoni collaborated on the character, Lucas saw an opportunity to turn Ashla into a Jedi Padawan in training during the Clone Wars, except her master would be none other than Anakin Skywalker. That's when Ashla became Ahsoka Tano. Giving Anakin a Padawan during the Clone Wars, when there was pretty much no mention of her during the films or previous canon, raises a lot of questions. Anakin is widely considered to be one of the most reckless Jedi. Isn't entrusting him with a Padawan kind of risky, especially since Anakin was only knighted at the start of the war? And where was Ahsoka in Revenge of the Sith? Does she die? Does she go into hiding? Does Anakin not care enough about her to bring her up at all? From her very introduction, Ahsoka immediately became one of the show's biggest mysteries. Setting up the exact circumstances that would determine her fate and role in Anakin's storyline would be several seasons in the making. Thankfully, the audience at least had a few of their questions answered right from the get-go. The Clone Wars movie shows us that Master Yoda assigned Ahsoka to Anakin as a means of discipline. Yoda recognized that Anakin was becoming fiercely independent and reckless, the type of qualities that could eventually lead one to the dark side. Not that Yoda necessarily foresaw this, but he knew that Anakin still had a long way to go before becoming a truly great Jedi. By being forced into the role of a teacher, maybe Anakin could grow past his fierce independence and reckless nature. Maybe he could learn to finally let go of his inner folly and completely embrace the lessons of the Jedi. Just maybe. Seeing Anakin become a teacher adds a whole new dimension to the character, one that communicates Anakin's values, beliefs, and shortcomings somewhat better than the films ever did. The Clone Wars movie offers only a hint of this dimension, but what it does offer was enough for the series to build off of. And, as we'll see, the way in which certain storylines throughout the show would test the dynamic between Anakin and Ahsoka would result in some of the most enriching character moments in all of Star Wars. And though audiences generally thought Ahsoka was an annoying character from her onset, using her newfound apprenticeship with Anakin as the focal point of the film was the right move to make. Starting out, The Clone Wars is very clearly directed at a younger audience. The humor, the banter between characters, and the focus on communicating simplistic wisdom to the viewer seems to indicate this. Not that older audiences couldn't appreciate the early episodes, but there was probably more to get out of the show as a kid than as an adult. Ahsoka, unlike everyone who surrounds her for almost the entire series, is just a teenage girl. She's a kid in an adult world, and the lessons she must learn to navigate that world are just as crucial to her as they are to the young viewers watching her. Just how Luke Skywalker in A New Hope is the viewer, growing and evolving to the world around him, Ahsoka Tano is the viewer as well. So while Ahsoka's introduction may lead us to think she's just a bratty teenager, out of place with her surroundings, that's kind of the point. And not only that, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. This was only the first chapter in Ahsoka's journey, and there were many more to come. As the Clone Wars movie drew to a close, audiences had their first taste of what George Lucas and Dave Filoni were working on in their upcoming animated series set to premiere on Cartoon Network. And man, they did not like it. To this day, many consider the Clone Wars to be the worst Star Wars movie ever made, if you feel it even deserves to be a part of the conversation. It's not clear why exactly Lucas thought it would be a good idea to release a TV movie theatrically, especially when it didn't really have an audience yet. Maybe Lucas felt he could make it up to the fans after the hate he received for the prequels. Maybe it really was to sell toys. Personally, I think it was just a prime George Lucas moment. A reminder that, for whatever reason, this gifted visionary should be kept in check. That while many of his ideas are groundbreaking, not all of them are good ideas. Having put a pretty poor foot forward, the first season of the Clone Wars was soon off to the races. I have a bad feeling about this. On October 3rd, 2008, Season 1 of Star Wars The Clone Wars officially premiered on Cartoon Network. In spite of the reception of the film, the TV premiere still drew in 3 million viewers, the biggest premiere ever for Cartoon Network at the time. The two episodes that premiered, Ambush and Rise of Malevolence, were clearly building off the tone of the film, but they weren't all that bad. In fact, both episodes were pretty fun, and showed great potential for the series. Ambush started a conversation that was new to Star Wars, and a theme that would become integral to the show's storytelling: the individuality of clones. In the films, the scant few interactions a character has with clones are cold and forgettable. The background EU wasn't really doing much for them either. In almost every medium, clones seemed almost obsessively duty-bound and detached from the violence of war. No offense to Karen Travis's many terrific novels, nor the campaign of the original Battlefront 2, but the clones were always somewhat generic. The Clone Wars was trying to give the clones a personality. It doesn't shine through so much in the first episode, But the fact that Yoda recognizes and values the individuality of the clones is a hard subversion from how the relationship between clones and Jedi was portrayed in the past.
Sire, rush not into fights. Long is the war. Only by surviving it will you prevail.
As the season went on, viewers would embark on a new Star Wars adventure every Friday night. Not every episode was worth tuning into, but some definitely were. One such episode, Rookies, furthered the concept of clone individuality with the introduction of Domino Squad. This episode is sort of like Red Dawn but with clones, which may not sound like much, but the really impressive aspect of this episode is D. Bradley Baker. There's about 5 or 6 main clone characters in this episode, but because of Baker's specific approach for each clone, they're fairly distinguishable from one another and become characters of their own by the end of the episode. Captain Rex and Commander Cody both have a resounding steadiness in their vocal performance, while Fives, Echo, and Heavy have much softer tones of voice. Combined with differing speech patterns and non-verbal communicators in the animation, Rookies prove that it's possible to make us care about an army of lookalikes and respect their individuality, much like Yoda in the first episode.
Heavy always did hate that place.
Then there's Lair of Grievous. I have a soft spot for this episode. It's maybe the only attempt the show ever gives at trying to explore Grievous's background, which is really a shame. The gothic influences of Grievous's lair are extremely fitting for the character, and the idea that Grievous is pretty much constantly rebuilding himself adds to the Frankenstein mythology Grievous embodies in this episode. It shows us that no matter how powerful Grievous thinks he is, he always has a master. This is his fatal flaw. And it's maybe the most meaningful characterization of Grievous in the entirety of Star Wars. Because while Grievous is a force to be reckoned with in Tartakovsky's Clone Wars, and a worthy opponent for Obi-Wan in Revenge of the Sith, he's not really a character. He's just a visually stimulating killing machine. The Clone Wars changed that. Also, Kit Fisto is uber cool. Dooku captured and the Gungan General see Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Dooku captured by a band of Weequay pirates commanded by Hondo Ohnaka. These 2 episodes have some of the best character banter in the entire show and put Dooku in probably the second most vulnerable situation we've seen him in, next to getting decapitated. One of the greatest things about the storytelling of the Clone Wars is how frequently characters are put in unlikely or inconvenient situations apart from the films. The writers use these scenarios as opportunities to show us more vulnerable aspects of characters we become familiar with. This arc is no exception. Also, Hondo Ohnaka rules. He's not just Jack Sparrow in Star Wars. This man sees Count Dooku, one of the most evil, powerful men in the galaxy, as a means of profit. He's not intimidated by him in the slightest. That makes him a serious contender for pretty much both sides of the war. Jim Cummings fills the character with so much personality and life that without his performance, the character just isn't the same. And it's probably the reason he became such a recurring character on the show.
Anakin, what? Control your insolence. The Count is concentrating.
Up to this point in the season, Dave Filoni and Henry Gilroy were largely responsible for coming up with the ideas for episodes. According to Filoni, Lucas didn't become directly involved in the story process until halfway through season 1. We don't know which episode that started with, but I'd wager it was with Jedi Crash and Defenders of Peace. These were the first of several episodes in the show to be written by Katie Lucas, and the first episodes to really tackle Lucas's anti-war sentiment. Ayla Secura, Ahsoka, and Rex land on a planet untouched by war and inhabited by a village of pacifist lemur people, the Lurmen. The digital artists make a point in showing how beautiful the world of Meriden is without the war, and Kevin Kiner's use of ethnic influences in the score further convey that. The Lurmen's way of life becomes threatened when the Separatists arrive to test a new superweapon, forcing the Lurmen to choose whether to hold fast to their pacifist principles or defend their way of life by engaging in violence. The conflict of these episodes largely derives from how the Lurmen feel about the Jedi's sudden arrival, and the fear and death that generally ensues. But the Separatist arrival signifies the importance of fighting for their principles, which is really what the Jedi stand for. Ultimately, these episodes offer a departure from the Jedi good, Sith bad narrative presented so far in the series in favor of a more complicated portrayal of the war. A portrayal that would evolve and become increasingly sophisticated as the writers behind the show explored more of Lucas's anti-war sentiment in seasons to come. The Ryloth arc might be the highlight of Season 1, a 3-part military campaign, following a different group of characters and different themes in each episode. The first of these, Storm over Ryloth, has Ahsoka dealing with failure for the first time in a significant way. It's not a comfortable feeling for her, and the writers weren't afraid to let her sit with it a while before things truly turned around. Even as a kid, I remember being taken aback by how devastated Ahsoka was by all the lives lost on her watch. If we follow the analogy that Ahsoka represents the viewer, then this episode sends a good message about the importance of confronting failure. It's a big moment for her growth as a character, and leads to one of the most satisfying final space battles in an episode. This frame of Anakin chilling in the escape pod is just perfect.
I'm just sitting here watching the show.
Innocence of Ryloth gives us a look at the treatment of civilians in war. Even after watching news updates about the war in the Middle East on TV with my parents, this episode showed me something that the news would never tell me. That there were kids like me, potentially without their parents, being caught in the crossfire.
Don't cry, kid. We'll keep you safe. I promise.
It's a sensitive topic, thankfully handled with grace and sincerity. Watching the clone Boyle learning to empathize with the orphan Twi'lek girl Numa preaches the value of compassion and acceptance of those who are different from us. It's again another great message to send younger viewers, and one that pretty much no other animated show would be willing to explore. Liberty on Ryloth is the culmination of the Republic's efforts to free the Twi'leks. Beyond serving as a showcase for the badassery of Mace Windu, this episode highlights the value of building bridges. Windu must help Champ Syndulla and Orn Free Taa put aside their differences for the greater good of their people, before the bloodshed escalates to a point of no return. Their eventual union makes for a satisfying finale to one of the most multifaceted arcs in the show's first season.
Here we go.
The true finale of Season 1, Hostage Crisis, follows a group of bounty hunters led by the bounty hunter terror Cad Bane as they hold the Senate hostage in exchange for the release of Zero from the Clone Wars movie. It's essentially an anti-heist taken to the extreme, embracing the violence and darkness that accompany the genre. Fresh off the summer of The Dark Knight, Kevin Kiner's score heavily emulates Hans Zimmer. You can even directly hear the Joker theme in parts of the episode. Filoni's killer cowboy design for Cad Bane and Corey Burton's menacing delivery gave viewers a hell of an impression back in 2009, but today he resides among the most fan-favorite bounty hunters in Star Wars. Crisis was easily the most violent episode in the series so far, and a possible hint of darker storylines to come. Clone Wars struggled a lot in its first season. For every memorable episode with a valid contribution to Star Wars, there's a forgettable episode that recycles plot points you've already seen. I do love the Malevolence arc. There's striking imagery throughout, well-edited moments that produce suspense, fun character banter, and lots of action. However, the arc is a prime example of what doesn't work about Season 1. You've already seen heroes blow up a superweapon in Star Wars, multiple times in fact. Not that the Clone Wars can't do it too, but the process by which our heroes destroy the weapon just rearranges plot points from the films. It's fun, but little else. The same can be said for every episode in which an ally betrays the main characters, Grievous narrowly escapes, or Jar Jar accidentally progresses the plot, and believe me, these things happen often. From watching the first season, it's hard not to get one of two impressions. Either the team behind the show was bereft of original ideas, or they were safely manufacturing Star Wars moments to make money off a new generation of young fans. It's more than likely the former, but the fact that it may come across otherwise should signal an issue. It doesn't help that the animation department still had some major hurdles to get over. Character models move very mechanically, which can make for some awkward fight scenes early in the season. The issue isn't ever completely resolved, but they did learn how to better hide the stiffness of the characters by season's end. Some of the 3D lighting makes characters look more like they're in a video game than an animated series, especially in Downfall of a Droid, which may be the worst looking episode in the show. And then, every once in a while, a character design pops up on screen that just seems odd. In spite of all its negatives, I should reiterate that the first season of Clone Wars isn't bad. Many of the episodes we highlighted prove that Dave Filoni and his writers have good stories to tell. Even the weaker episodes of the show demonstrate potential for more interesting storylines down the road. The main cast is given many opportunities to shine, especially Ahsoka, who spends a lot of time this season under the tutelage of various Jedi Masters, learning both her strengths and many weaknesses. Many fans went from hating Ahsoka to either tolerating or liking her by the end of the season. That's progress in my book. So yes, the first season is flawed, but many of its flaws are forgivable. Even with Lucas's vision and resources, the studio was still figuring out a lot of things for the first time. With more time and new stories to tell, many of their challenges would vanish, but not if Season 1 hadn't come first. This is the worst season of the Clone Wars, but still fun and worth watching in its own right. And damn if I didn't enjoy it as a kid. And that's the end of part 1. I want to thank you all for watching it. This video took over 60 hours to make, not including the 40 plus hours I spent rewatching the entire series. So if you enjoyed what you just watched, please leave a like and maybe subscribe. It goes a long way. The Clone Wars is a big show, and we've barely scratched the surface of it so far. So I'm gonna make like a Clone Wars arc and split this series into 3 videos. In part 2, we'll be talking about seasons 2 through 5. That sounds like a lot, but trust me, I have a plan of attack. I don't have many videos on the channel so far, but if you can't tell from this upload alone, I put a lot of time and energy into each and every video, whether it's about video games, movies, or television. I'll soon be opening up a Patreon for the channel, but for now, like I said, a simple subscribe goes a very long way in the growth of the channel. That's all I got. No ads, paid promotion, or stuff like that. Just my gratitude for your support. Stay tuned for part 2, and I'll be seeing you all next time. May the Force be with you.
And believe me, the people that make these movies like myself, we sit there and we go, when we watch it, we're like, oh, we should have done that instead. And I look at the producer, hey, can I change? No, there's no money? No money? Okay, I guess we're done.